The story begins long before the first American soldier stepped onto Afghan soil, long before satellites scanned the ridges of the Hindu Kush, and long before the world imagined a war that would stretch across 2 decades. If there is one truth that repeats itself in Afghan memory, it is that foreign powers arrive with confidence, but rarely with caution. Afghan history holds warnings clear, painful, carved into mountains and valleys, but somehow, every empire that enters seems to hear them too late. That is why the story behind Afghan history that warned the U.S. but no one listened is not simply about strategy or miscalculation. It is about the silence of history, the arrogance of power, and the cost of ignoring a nation that remembers every invasion far better than those who invade. It begins with a landscape that outsiders misunderstand from the very first step. Afghanistan is not just mountains and deserts. It is a map of shifting loyalties, ancient rivalries, tribal codes, and memories that stretch across generations. When the U.S. entered Afghanistan with speed, technology, and overwhelming global support, there was a sense of certainty of belief that victory would be quick, that the enemy was simple to identify, that the mission was clear. But Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, shows that the roots of failure were planted long before the first skirmish. They were planted in the stories of outsiders who came confident and left confused. Stories that every Afghan child grows up hearing around fires, courtyards, and cold mountain nights. When the British Empire marched into Afghanistan in the 19th century, they carried the same belief that great powers often hold, that superior force can bend a land to their will. The mountains answered them differently. Entire units disappeared without warning. The terrain swallowed armies whole. Tribes that seemed friendly one day turned silent the next. This is the first warning that echoes in Afghan history, that warned the U.S., but no one listened. The land itself is not passive. It chooses when to reveal its people. It decides when to shield them. Outsiders walk into traps without ever knowing they are traps. The British learned it. The Soviets learned it. And still, the United States, with all the lessons of history available, walked into the same pattern. But why? Why did Afghan history fail to reach American policymakers, generals, advisors, and intelligence analysts? Why did a conflict so deeply tied to identity, loyalty, and memory get treated as if it were a simple battlefield map with clear targets? This is where the real curiosity builds. Because Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, is not only about mistakes, but about the blindness that power can create. As the U.S. arrived, Afghan tribal elders already knew what would happen. They had seen it before the arrival of foreign troops. The promises of stability, the belief that technology could conquer geography. Some elders even whispered old proverbs that predicted the future. One of them, repeated many times in Afghan villages, says, "The foreigner has the watch, but we have the time." And time has always been Afghanistan's strongest weapon. Empires grow impatient, Afghans endure. Where great powers measure progress in months, Afghans measure it in generations. That alone is one of the core truths behind Afghan history that warned the U.S. But no one listened. The Americans expected a fast collapse of resistance after the first battles. And yes, the initial victories came quickly, too quickly. Villages were cleared, strongholds bombed, leaders scattered. But Afghan resistance never vanishes the way outsiders expect. It shifts into the mountains, blends into families, moves through valleys like wind. History shows this again and again, yet it went unheard. This script, inspired by Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, reveals how the early months of the war created an illusion of victory that history warned against, but was ignored in the rush of triumph. Soon, the U.S. faced a puzzle that every foreign force before it had struggled with. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Fighters who were invisible by day appeared suddenly at night. Intelligence that seemed reliable one week collapsed the next. Entire regions changed hands, not by force, but by the shifting of tribal alliances that outsiders could not understand. In Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. This becomes one of the central themes, the misunderstanding of Afghan loyalty. Loyalty in Afghanistan is not bought with money and not enforced with fear. It is earned through respect, through honor, through generations of agreements that foreigners rarely see. The U.S. relied on quick deals, payments, and short-term alliances. On paper, they looked effective. On the ground, they were fragile. History showed that alliances formed under pressure collapsed just as quickly. Yet again, Afghan history held a warning. When the Soviets tried to control Afghanistan, they too handed out money and promises. They too turned local fighters into temporary allies. And the moment the pressure lifted, those alliances shattered. So when the U.S. repeated the same pattern, Afghan elders knew the outcome before it unfolded. That is why the title, Afghan History, that warned the U.S., but no one listened, is more than a phrase. It is the emotional truth of a war that repeated old mistakes. But history's warnings were not only military, they were cultural, emotional, and deeply human. Foreigners often underestimate how memory works in Afghan society. A promise kept is remembered for decades. A betrayal is remembered for centuries. When the U.S. made promises, it could not keep promises of stability, security, economic transformation. It unknowingly planted seeds of frustration that grew into a nationwide disillusionment. Afghan history that warned the U.S. But no one listened shows that expectations in Afghanistan do not fade quietly. They turn into stories passed down. They become reasons for resistance. As the years passed, American troops discovered a truth that Afghan villagers already knew. The mountains do not reveal secrets easily. Fighters move like shadows. Information travels through whispers carried by families, not through electronic systems. Local knowledge is everything. But local knowledge cannot be forced, it must be earned. And once again, Afghan history had attempted to warn the U.S. that understanding Afghanistan requires patience, humility, and emotional awareness. But wars driven by urgency rarely allow for patience, and power rarely allows for humility. This is why the phrase Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, feels heavy with meaning. It is not accusing, it is not political, it is historical truth. History speaks, but only to those willing to hear it. In the early years, American troops walked through villages, believing they could win hearts and minds with handshakes and aid packages. Many Afghans appreciated the help, but appreciation is not allegiance. Outsiders often assume that kindness creates loyalty, but Afghan loyalty is built differently. It is built on protection, reputation, shared struggle, and a feeling that someone will remain when things grow difficult. Afghans had seen outsiders come and go. They knew that eventually, foreign powers leave. This shaped every interaction, every alliance, every decision. The U.S. operated on short-term timelines. Afghans operated on long-term survival. This mismatch shaped everything, and it is another warning woven into Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. As the script continues, the emotional weight deepens. Stories emerge of villagers torn between sides, of elders trying to keep peace, of fighters blending into the fabric of daily life. The line between war and life blurred, just as history predicted. Outsiders expected clear enemies and clear friends, but Afghan history shows that conflict here is never black and white. It is layered, complex, shaped by fear, honor, and survival. These are the lessons that warned the U.S., yet slipped away in the noise of modern warfare. The truth becomes more haunting when you realize that Afghan people themselves were often the ones trying to warn foreign forces. Local leaders spoke about tribal tensions, mountain routes, winter patterns, ancient rivalries, and unspoken rules. But modern militaries often trust technological data over human wisdom. They listen to satellites more than shepherds, drones more than elders, scientific reports more than cultural memory. And when you ignore memory in a place built on memory, you pay a price. This is the heart of Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. The first batch ends with a quiet but powerful realization. The war was lost, not in battlefields, but in misunderstandings, in the space between history and strategy, between memory and ambition, between those who knew the land and those who believed they could shape it. But no one listened. Afghans knew change arrives fast, but leaves even faster. What remains afterwards is always their burden to carry. As U.S. forces expanded their presence, military bases appeared across the country like islands in a storm. They were built with confidence, with the belief that these installations would anchor stability. But Afghanistan is not a place that bends around bases or checkpoints. It bends around relationships, around unwritten agreements, around quiet understandings formed long before foreigners arrive. This subtle but powerful cultural truth once again stands as part of Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. The Americans built structures. Afghans measured trust. The two rarely aligned. In those early years, the U.S. believed that winning local support required resources: schools, wells, food, money, roads. And while Afghans appreciated improvements, they did not understand them as signs of permanent protection. In Afghan culture, gratitude and loyalty are not the same. Gratitude can be given instantly. Loyalty must be earned slowly. It is earned through time, through consistency, through moments when danger appears and someone stands beside you. Afghans had learned from their past that foreigners may bring gifts, but they also bring uncertainty. They may help today, but they may leave tomorrow. This lesson, deeply rooted in memory, once again formed the quiet backbone of Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. In many remote villages, elders would sit under old mulberry trees or inside mud brick hudras and discuss how history was repeating itself. A man who farms by day may have a cousin who works with one group, a brother who supports another, and an obligation to protect his village above all else. These layers cannot be detected from the air. They can only be understood by living among the people. This is why intelligence failures kept repeating, not because information was missing, but because context was missing. And once again, this reflects the painful truth inside Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. American forces soon encountered contradictions that made no sense to them. Afghanistan required patience, flexibility, and historical awareness. This mismatch became the silent force shaping the conflict's future. Warriors in the mountains moved with the rhythm of the land. Soldiers moved with the rhythm of orders. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened once again, showed that a land governed by memory does not yield to tactics that ignore it. Meanwhile, the psychological landscape of Afghanistan shaped the war just as much as the physical landscape. Afghans have a long tradition of respecting strength and aggression, but strength rooted in honor, fairness, and steadfastness. When foreign forces acted respectfully, many Afghans admired them. When mistakes happened, when civilian casualties occurred, when misunderstandings turned into tragedies, memories formed instantly and stayed forever. In Afghan culture, a single moment can define an entire generation's perspective. Stories of injustice spread faster than reports of development. A small error in a remote village could influence dozens of families and hundreds of decisions. This emotional sensitivity has been part of Afghan history for centuries, and ignoring it was one of the critical elements of Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened. The U.S. also underestimated the resilience of rural Afghan communities. Life in these regions is harsh. Survival is taught from childhood. Young boys herd animals through freezing winters and scorching summers, learning the terrain intimately. Women manage homes under conditions that demand strength and resourcefulness. Men memorize mountain paths, water routes, hidden caves, and safe shelters. These skills have been passed down through generations, shaped by landscapes that demand respect. Foreign troops, no matter how well trained, could not match this native understanding of the land. This reality was not a tactical insight, it was a historical truth, and history had already warned. Afghanistan belongs to those who know its silence. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, was not a prophecy. It was an observation made countless times before. As the conflict continued, misunderstandings deepened. American troops would conduct searches in villages, often following intelligence that was incomplete or manipulated by local rivalries. Afghans, already cautious, became more defensive. Some villagers cooperated out of hope. Others cooperated out of fear. But cooperation built on pressure dissolves quickly. And as trust eroded, information turned unreliable. False claims circulated. Old grudges were disguised as intelligence. They said foreign powers come with determination, but Afghanistan teaches patience. They said no matter how strong an army is, it cannot fight the mountains, the winter, the silence, the memory. And in those quiet discussions, inside mudrooms, under the stars, on cold nights, the warnings of history lived clearly. Afghans listened to those warnings. The question is, why the United States did not? As Batch 2 ends, the emotional weight of this complex historical cycle becomes more powerful. The seeds of the later collapse had already been planted not through any single failure, but through the repetition of old patterns that Afghan history had already warned against. But the most dramatic revelations are still ahead. The middle years of the war brought a strange mixture of confidence and confusion. Reports traveling back to Washington painted a picture of slow but steady progress, as if the situation was gradually bending toward stability. But in reality, Afghanistan was bending toward something else entirely, a quiet reshaping of power that happened far from the eyes of officials. This contrast between reported progress and lived reality lies at the heart of Afghan history. That warned the U.S., but no one listened. What was interpreted as momentum was often just motion. What appeared to be stability was often only silence before another shift. American troops on the ground felt this difference long before policymakers did. Many soldiers noticed that villages which once welcomed them now greeted them with hesitation. Elders stopped making eye contact. Children who once gathered around military vehicles stayed inside their homes. These were not signs of hostility. They were signs of uncertainty. When foreign powers communicate one message but act in ways that suggest another, Afghans trust their eyes, not their ears. Inside Afghan villages, whispers grew more frequent. Who would control the region tomorrow? Who would protect them once foreign forces left? These questions were not asked out loud, but they were felt in every hesitation, every careful answer, every closed door. Afghans have endured generations of uncertainty. They know how to prepare for shifting power, and preparation usually means silence. As silence grew, American troops felt increasingly isolated. This pattern shaped decisions across many provinces, influenced alliances, and slowly built a shadow reality beneath the official narrative. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, shows that many decisions were made, not because of preference, but because of survival. In many areas, U.S. forces misinterpreted Afghan neutrality as hostility. But neutrality is a survival strategy, not an ideological stance. Villagers had learned through centuries that taking sides too early leads to danger. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened reveals that authentic relationships mattered, but they were not strong enough to rewrite the weight of history. The emotional landscape grew more complicated when political shifts began appearing on the horizon. Afghans sensed that foreign commitment was weakening long before official announcements were made. Just as their ancestors had sensed the British withdrawal and the Soviet departure, modern Afghans felt the early tremors. Conversations changed. Eyes revealed worry. Young men discussed options quietly at night. Elders tried to prepare their communities. This awareness did not come from news channels or official briefings. It came from instinct, sharpened by centuries of surviving foreign involvement. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, shows that Afghans did not predict the future. They recognized an old pattern returning. Meanwhile, American policy grew inconsistent, shifting with each new administration and political pressure. Long-term strategy became short-term reaction. Troop numbers fluctuated, objectives changed, partners changed, messaging changed, but Afghans value consistency, not power. They trust continuity, not technology. When leadership changes repeatedly, confidence fractures. In Afghan culture, leadership is respected when it remains steady in difficult times. This expectation was deeply mismatched with the political cycles driving the war. Afghan history that warned the U.S., but no one listened, shows that Afghans saw instability where Americans saw democracy. Afghans interpreted these shifts as signs that the foreign presence was temporary, not because the U.S. lacked strength, but because it lacked enduring commitment. In those years, the seeds of collapse were already taking root, not because the U.S. failed militarily, but because history had laid out a blueprint that was not followed. Afghanistan cannot be reshaped quickly. Its culture cannot be understood from a distance. Its alliances cannot be forced. Its loyalty cannot be bought, and its history cannot be ignored. The deeper the United States moved into Afghanistan, the more they drifted unknowingly into the same cycle that had trapped every foreign power before them. Roads built in haste began to crack, alliances formed in urgency began to wobble, and confidence that once seemed unbreakable shifted into quiet uncertainty. Yet none of this was new. Afghan villages had seen rising empires come with promises, only to vanish like dust storms that arrive loudly and disappear without warning. What us planners saw as unexpected resistance was, to Afghans, simply the repetition of a chapter they had memorized generations ago. American soldiers often described moments when they felt the land itself resisted them. A village that welcomed them warmly in the morning would turn completely silent the next day. A market that seemed safe for weeks would suddenly feel tense, though no one said a word. It was as if an invisible current moved beneath the surface, and everyone except the foreigners understood its meaning. This silence was not hostility. It was caution born from centuries of shifting rulers, empires, invasions, and sudden punishments that fell hardest on ordinary families. That silence had protected Afghans through monarchy, civil wars, Soviet occupation, and internal power struggles long before Americans ever arrived. Inside government offices in Kabul, U.S. advisors pushed for rapid reforms, new courts, new police forces, new leadership structures, not realizing that Afghanistan's history had taught its people to distrust anything that appeared to suddenly. Afghans knew that power flows differently in their land, through elders, tribes, reputation, and patience. But foreign systems were installed like software updates, fast, efficient, and incompatible with the centuries-old operating system already running beneath Afghan society. And when things broke, American officials blamed corruption, inefficiency, or culture, without recognizing that history itself had warned them this approach would fail. In remote districts, American commanders asked locals, "Who controls this area?" expecting a clear answer. But Afghans knew that control shifts with the wind, one group by morning, another by night, a third by influence rather than presence. This fluidity existed long before the United States. It was how Afghans survived invasions, by becoming unreadable. Yet the U.S. interpreted this as dishonesty, not as survival instinct shaped by centuries of danger. Even worse, America trusted maps that showed districts shaded neatly in green for safe, yellow for contested, and red for hostile. But Afghanistan had never been a land that obeyed straight lines drawn on paper. Boundaries were emotional, relational, and historical. Influence traveled through stories, fears, loyalties, debts, and memories, things that satellites cannot detect, drones cannot record, and analysts cannot quantify. The U.S. believed control was a matter of physical presence, but Afghans understood it was a matter of perception. Across the country, the same historical warning sign kept repeating itself. Foreign powers always mistake silence for agreement, progress for permanence, and presence for control. The British made that mistake in the 1800s. The Soviets repeated it in the 1980s. And now the U.S. was unknowingly stepping into the same trap. A trap built not by enemies, but by misunderstanding a society shaped by centuries of conflict. Many American officials believed that winning hearts and minds was simply a matter of building infrastructure or offering aid. But Afghans had seen this pattern before too. Every invader built things. The British built roads. The Soviets built schools and hospitals. Each time, Afghans used the projects but did not tie their loyalty to the builders. They knew invaders eventually leave, but villages remain. In Afghan memory, protecting the village was protecting the future. Aligning too openly with foreign forces could be dangerous when those forces eventually disappeared, as history indicated they always did. In strategic meetings, advisors spoke confidently about turning points and milestones. unaware that Afghanistan had never bent smoothly to timelines set by outsiders. Afghan time moves differently. It stretches, it delays, it adapts. A village dispute can last years. A tribal feud can last generations. A foreign occupation, no matter how strong, is seen as temporary. When Americans set deadlines for success, Afghans quietly understood that these deadlines revealed something important, that the foreign presence itself was temporary, no matter the promises. In rural communities, locals frequently watched American convoys pass through, their armored vehicles heavy with symbols of power. But power in Afghanistan works differently. True authority is soft-spoken, respected quietly, remembered through actions rather than displays. The U.S. believed strength came from visibility. Afghan history taught that strength came from patience and hidden influence. These two worldviews clashed silently, and in that clash, the seeds of failure were planted. There were moments when U.S. soldiers felt they were building trust, eating with families, sharing tea, learning basic phrases of Dari or Pashto, and often, these moments were genuine. Afghans valued hospitality deeply, but hospitality did not automatically translate into allegiance. This distinction existed throughout Afghan history. Empires mistook kindness for loyalty, misunderstanding that Afghans could treat a guest warmly while still refusing to take sides. This was not deception. It was wisdom, the kind that had preserved villages long after armies burned through their valleys. Night after night, in American bases scattered across the country, soldiers discussed how unpredictable everything felt. Rules seemed to change without warning. Allies felt uncertain. Villages that once seemed supportive suddenly stepped back. But none of this was random. Afghanistan was following the same pattern it always followed. It protected itself first. Behind closed doors, some American analysts and diplomats warned Washington that history was repeating itself. They wrote reports explaining that rapid modernization had failed in previous eras, that centralized power had never held Afghanistan together, that foreign-backed governments rarely survived once foreign troops withdrew. These were the same warnings historians had repeated for decades. Yet these warnings were overshadowed by political pressure, optimism, or the belief that America's strength would break the cycle where others had failed. The truth, however, was more complex. The United States had overwhelming power, but Afghanistan had overwhelming resilience, not resistance, resilience. The resilience of a people who had survived empires, kings, conquerors, and superpowers. Every time foreign forces tried to impose a new system quickly, Afghan society absorbed the pressure, bent slightly, and then returned to its original shape once the pressure faded. In many ways, American troops fought not just individuals, but centuries of inherited mistrust, centuries of trauma, centuries of stories passed down about invaders who promised stability but delivered suffering. These stories were not propaganda. They were lived history, and this history shaped how Afghans interpreted every action, every promise, every decision made by the United States. The most haunting part was that America believed they were bringing something entirely new: democracy, development, freedom, opportunity. But the villagers who listened politely to these promises had heard versions of them before, from kings who promised modernization, from Soviets who promised equality, from warlords who promised unity. None endured. And so Afghans learned to wait, to watch, and to survive until the next shift in power arrived. The real tragedy was that both sides wanted stability. Both sides believed they were doing the right thing, but their visions of stability were built on entirely different foundations. The United States looked for quick results. Afghans looked for outcomes that would still matter 50 years later. These two timelines were never compatible. By the fourth year of conflict, many Americans began to realize something unsettling. They were fighting patterns older than their own nation, patterns older than the British Empire, older than the Soviet Union, patterns that existed in the stories of Afghan grandfathers and great-grandfathers, stories warning that foreign powers always come with confidence and leave with confusion. And so, as the years passed, the United States found itself entangled not just in a war, but in a story much older than anything they had ever studied. Afghanistan was not a battlefield. It was a memory of every empire that came before, a memory of mistakes repeated, of warnings ignored, of lessons carved into mountains and woven into poetry long before America was born. The deeper the U.S. stepped into the conflict, the more it felt as if the past was folding into the present, reminding them that Afghanistan was a place where history never slept. American policymakers believed that with enough resources, technology, and training, they could engineer a modern state. But Afghan history had warned that legitimacy cannot be purchased. It must be grown from within the soil of local trust, tribal respect, and centuries-old customs. Afghanistan had always rejected models imported from outside because they didn't fit the terrain, not geographically, not culturally, not historically. Yet, inside conference rooms in Washington, presentations continued to show progress, charts and upward arrows. Stability indexes climbed. Surveys claimed support. Officials congratulated one another. But thousands of miles away, on dusty Afghan roads, soldiers could feel something entirely different. They felt that the conflict was shifting beneath their feet, like the ground itself was refusing to let foreign power take root. For many Afghans, the central government in Kabul had always been a distant idea. Rural communities relied on elders, families, and local arbitration long before modern state systems existed. When America tried to strengthen a centralized government overnight, Afghan society simply could not absorb it. This wasn't corruption or incompetence. It was historical reality, a reality that warned foreign powers again and again. Afghanistan is a mosaic of identities, not a single monolithic structure. Any attempt to reshape it too quickly would crack the foundation. U.S. planners underestimated another force to memory. Afghanistan remembers everything. Villages remember who helped them generations ago, who betrayed them, who arrived with armies, and who left in the middle of the night. These memories guided decisions as much as any modern political strategy. When Americans entered villages speaking about hope and change, many Afghans listened politely but remembered other armies who once made similar promises. This historical memory shaped everyday decisions in ways the U.S. could not see. A father who refused to speak openly with foreign soldiers wasn't being unfriendly. He was protecting his family from a future he couldn't predict. A village that avoided siding with the U.S. wasn't being deceptive. It was practicing a survival strategy older than the concept of modern warfare. But because American analysts interpreted these behaviors through a Western lens, they misunderstood the intentions behind them. Afghanistan's mountains, deserts, and valleys played their own role too. Terrain wasn't just geography, it was culture, identity, and strategy. The land itself teaches patience, it teaches caution, it teaches endurance. Empires that moved quickly fell quickly. The ones that lasted were those that moved slowly, learning the language, the customs, and the rhythms of life. America, pressured by global expectations, elections, and shifting priorities, simply didn't have the time to adapt to Afghan time, which flows like water rather than marching like an army. And so the cycle repeated. The U.S. pushed reforms faster than Afghanistan could accept them, and Afghanistan resisted changes faster than the U.S. could adjust. It wasn't a clash of armies, it was a clash of timelines. America's timeline was measured in years. Afghanistan's was measured in generations. As the war stretched on, more American officials admitted privately what historians had warned publicly. Progress in Afghanistan was not impossible, but it had to move at the speed of culture, not the speed of foreign strategy. Yet, by the time these warnings echoed through policy circles, it was already too late. The conflict had set into motion patterns that could not easily be reversed. In villages where U.S. forces once handed out supplies, children grew up watching first one foreign power leave, then another. In government offices where Americans drafted ambitious reform plans, Afghan officials wondered how long these promises would last. In training centers where the U.S. invested billions, soldiers questioned whether their institutions would stand once foreign support withdrew. These doubts were not created by propaganda. They were shaped by a long line of historical precedents. The longer America stayed, the more its presence resembled the chapters of past empires, even if the intentions were different. Without realizing it, the U.S. had stepped into a story that was already written, a story in which Afghanistan always outlasts outside powers. Not through strength, but through endurance. The U.S. had technology, funding, and global influence. But Afghanistan had time, and time had always been the deciding factor in this land. By the late years of the war, the U.S. found itself fighting uncertainty more than any enemy. They fought doubt, miscommunication, cultural gaps, and historical patterns. And quietly, unpleasantly, officials began to admit that Afghanistan had warned them long before the first troops landed. Historians warned them, locals warned them, elders whispered warnings in the early days when tea was shared in dusty compounds. But these warnings drowned under confidence, resources, and the belief that America's involvement would rewrite destiny. In the end, Afghanistan proved once again that history does not disappear simply because a new power arrives with new tools. History lives in the land, in the people, in the stories whispered by grandmothers and elders. And when the United States finally withdrew, Afghanistan followed the same pattern it had followed with previous empires, absorbing the foreign presence, waiting for the dust to settle, and returning to a path shaped not by outside forces, but by its own unbroken, complicated, resilient identity. And that is why the title of your documentary is not just a headline, it is a truth carved by time itself. Afghan history that warned the U.S. but no one listened.